God's been showing me the most important thing is that the relationships are the mission. I get really excited about, let's go start the new thing. Let's go take the hill. The next thing. But really, what God's showing me is those faithful relationships that you built, and those people who've found their own calling, and they're committed to Christ, and they're committed to these, reaching people. That's really what it's all about. That's where the seeds of the gospel have found good soil and produced a harvest.
Welcome to Real Faith, Real World, where we connect the faith within us with the world around us. This podcast is a resource of World Methodist Evangelism, where we connect, equip, and encourage networks of Christian leaders to build faith-sharing movements around the world. My name is Rob Haynes. Thank you for listening, and thank you to the generosity of the people at Christ Church Memphis for their continued support of this podcast. We continue our series of Innovating Church today with a discussion with Michael Beck on fresh expressions. Many people have tried to look at the church outside of the four walls, and fresh expressions is one of those ways in which people are innovating by moving out into the places where people already are, rather than asking them to come to church. Michael is a key leader in fresh expressions, both in the United States and around the world. He's written so much and produced so much material on this that even this short conversation, I know, is going to be a blessing to you. Michael, welcome to the Real Faith, Real World podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be with you, Rob.
So we're launching a series on Innovating Church, and your focus has been on fresh expressions, and you've done a ton of work on that and given a great deal of insight and wisdom. But before we get too far into that, tell us about yourself a little bit. Help our listeners get to know you.
Sure. So I was born addicted, and my mother was not able to care for me. She kind of struggled with drug addiction her whole life, and my biological father was unknown. So my grandparents adopted me at birth, and they started bringing me this little Methodist church down the street in our neighborhood, St. Mark's UMC. And the people there, they rallied around me at my infant baptism, and they committed to raise me in a community of love and forgiveness. And they fed me through their never-ending potlucks and nurtured me in the faith. And my grandparents died when I was a kid, and I became a street kid, in and out of juvenile detention facilities, went very far from the church.
Yeah.
And ultimately had an encounter with the risen Christ that transformed my life and sent me back to that little church. And I was fortunate that when I came home, that there was a pastor there, Pastor Dan Jones, who said, "Hey, I'm glad Jesus has saved your soul, but AA will save your butt." But he used another word there. But and he said, "Meet me at the noon meeting tomorrow, so I can show you how to do life sober and clean." And
wow.
So I went into ministry with this, clear love of the church, and I experienced the church as this loving, nurturing community. But I also know life apart from that church, and I know people that are never going to come to church, no matter how good we do it.
Right.
And so I live in that tension of like really loving the inherited church and really wanted to reach those people outside of it. And just last thing I'll say, during the pandemic, I was sent back, my wife and I, to St. Mark's United Methodist Church to be the pastor. Yeah. So now the place where I was baptized, I preach, and some of the people who were there at my infant baptism are there as my flock today. So,
wow.
Yeah,
That's a beautiful story. And where exactly is St. Mark's located?
Yeah, it's in Ocala, Florida. Sorry
Hmm.
about that.
That's okay.
In North Central Florida area, just south of Gainesville.
Yeah, that's a beautiful area. So you've had a bit of a winding road into ministry, and that's given you some different experiences to bring to the conversation that you have in ministry. So maybe that informs some of your work in Fresh Expressions. But before we get too far into that, just explain what is a fresh expression.
Yeah, so the textbook definition of a fresh expression is a form of church for our changing culture established primarily for the benefit of people who are not yet members of any church. I like to just say it's church for people that don't go to church.
Okay.
And we have these four values that we talk about in the Fresh Expressions movement that they're missional, contextual, formational, and ecclesial. So they're these forms of church that happen and spring up where people do life. We have a network of 15 of these connected to my church. And so we have church in a tattoo parlor, church in a dog park, church in a Moe's Southwest Grill, church in a yoga studio, church in a Facebook group, church in a virtual reality church, one of our newer Fresh Expressions, and which happens in Alt Space VR, and then church in a we started a recovery church at St. Mark's as well. But so if you can just imagine church springing up with people that don't go to church around the practices and things that they already do every week, that's essentially what Fresh Expressions of Church are. And they're connected to the inherited church. They're not these little things. We're not saying, hey, we're leaving the church behind in the rear view, the traditional church. We're trying to help them live together in a symbiosis, which I call a blended ecology of church.
Okay. A lot of terms that we've got there we can unpack. So when you say an inherited church, what do you mean by that? Do you mean just a traditional church that just sings hymns, or are you talking about even if we have guitars and drums, we can still be an inherited church?
Yeah, thank you for clarifying. I sometimes throw these terms out there,
That's okay.
but
No worries.
yeah, the inherited church to me is not like this burdensome thing we've inherited that we got to now figure out to do with. It's this precious thing, the inheritance of our faith. That the saints of the past have given their prayers, presence, gift, service, witness to hand us and give us this beautiful thing. So the inherited church can take many dimensions. It can be traditional, it can be contemporary, it can be a church plant. It can be, multiple things. But what we mean by that is more of the attractional, gathered form of church, like what we see in Jerusalem in the book of Acts. And the Fresh Expressions, we call those emerging or missional modes of church, which are more that scattered vision of the church. So like Antioch and church in homes and banquet halls and all of that. So that's what I mean by inherited church.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks. And you describe them as missional and ecclesial. And can you kind of help us unpack some of those terms as well?
Sure. So when we're thinking about a fresh expression of church, like how can we tell that it's church, right?
Right.
So when we say, because some people say that's just people gathering together in a tattoo parlor, what's happening there? So they're missional, meaning they're part of the Missio Dei, they're part of the mission of God, that God draws us into that mission and sends us out into the world, that we exist not for ourselves, but we exist to as God's missional instrument in the earth, that we draw people into the life of God, into the Trinity as we form church with people. It's contextual in that church takes the shape and the language and the customs of the people where we are. So all the forms of church, for instance, baptism, communion, that's happening in the tattoo parlor. That's happening
Right.
in the burrito joint, but we're taking a tortilla and some high C in the communion chalice, and we're having the Lord's Supper in a contextual way. And they're formational. So people are being formed as disciples of Jesus. We're learning to bend our life to the truth of Scripture. We're going on that journey of sanctification together. And they're ecclesial in that they're fully church. Like people in tattoo parlor church, like this is my church. This is it. But they're also ecclesial in that they're part of a connection, or they're part of the larger church across the earth. So we try to get down to, and I'm sorry, it's a really long answer, to the Nicene Creed. There's a lot of wisdom there. The creed says a lot about God the Father, a lot about God the Son, a little bit about God the Holy Spirit. Didn't quite know what to do with the wild child of the Trinity there. But then when we get to the church, it's just 4 words: one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. So there's a oneness to the church. Paul gives us those ones in Ephesians: one Lord, one God, one baptism, one Father of all. There's a unity there. There's a holiness. So there's a upward. We are encountering a holy God of chesed, who's of unfailing love, who's shaping us and forming us. There's a Catholicity to the church, little c. So we're connected to the church universal. And then obviously there's an apostolic dimension where we're sent out and church forming where people live and do life.
Yeah. Well, Michael, there's so much to talk about there. I guess the question that someone may have is, why do this? Why can't we just improve all of these other great structures that we have? And I mean, like the story of St. Mark's, it was something that nurtured you. So why not just make St. Mark's the greatest it can be? Why have to go out to these other places that you mentioned?
Yeah, and I want to be careful as I share this not to get caught in the tyranny of the either or. And I think we do need to do the best St. Mark's ever. Like, I am fully devoted to good worship and preaching and Bible studies and all those things. And that's happening at our inherited congregations. And I think the reason we have to do it is because we're in a post-Christendom society. People aren't connecting with that form of church largely. Now, in many cases, they are. Like, some would say 40% of the population or whatever will still connect with that. Well, that's a lot of people. So we need to continue to do that.
Right.
We're not as far down the road into post-Christendom as like the United Kingdom or in England, who I have lots of friends over there. And they say, we are from your future. This is coming to you, but we're not there yet.
Right.
But so do we love people enough in our community and in our context to go out and share the gospel with them in a new and creative and fresh way and build community around that? And that's why it doesn't matter how awesome we do in Heritage Church. If we only do that, we will just miss a lot of people. And I think there's a theological, biblical rationale that the way that God makes his dwelling with us and manifests God's presence has always been from the tabernacle, wandering around, moving, mobile God, to the temple, stationary God, draw all people to God's self on God's holy hill. We see the synagogue mode kind of in between there, like a blend of those. And then in Acts, we see gathered and scattered, God calling people into these attractional forms of worship, and God sending and church happening at the dinner table and everything else. So I just think we've been able to, in a Christendom scenario, to just do attractional only church, and it's worked because we've largely, in some sense, had some kind of a Christian culture. We could argue about how much that's true, but that's just not the context where we are in the United States anymore.
So let's talk about that context in the United States. Some people listening may be from overseas as well. But you mentioned England just a minute ago, and Fresh Expressions came out of the United Kingdom at the direction of the Archbishop, calling all the Anglican churches together, basically trying to figure out why aren't people coming to church. We have all these parishes. Everyone has the care of a parish priest. Everyone is known, or at least has the opportunity to be known by the priest in the area, but still we're seeing decline in participation in worship, in study, in formation. And out of that was this idea that we could connect with people on the athletic fields, or in the coffee shops, or places like that. So, here in the United States or in other parts of the world where we don't have that parish system, someone might drive past 2 or 3 churches on their way to their own church on any particular Sunday. So I guess if someone were listening and say, well, aren't you just competing with all these other things out there? Isn't this just creating more distractions? And what would you say to that one?
Yeah, and I love I know Rob, you and I have both had opportunity to learn from our friends in the UK, and
Yeah.
that landmark document, the Mission Shaped Church Report with Bishop Graham Cray, where they kind of named some things that were in this network
Hmm.
society. So flows and globalized, connected by technology, kind of people connect around practices. The third place, an essential concept, like people gather in those third places, which is not your home or your workspace, but your neutral, common places where people kind of gather to do life.
Right.
And so they kind of named, hey, church is starting to happen there too. There's this movement of the Holy Spirit kind of breaking out all around us, but not really coming into the inherited church. And I would say that these are not in any way in competition. They're actually in complement,
Okay.
because those people aren't going to come to church. The folks that we're forming these fresh expressions with, it's very unlikely they would ever come to our inherited church.
Mm.
And the metaphor that I like to use, and sorry, this is going to be for our global audience, this can be a very American metaphor, but
Okay.
football, like, every team has to have an offense and a defense.
Hmm.
And I feel like the church that we've inherited is almost like we have a defense, but not a real good offensive strategy to like go out into the world and actually reach people that are currently being unreached.
Right.
So it's like it's 4th and 1, and we're in our own end zone, and we're just trying to figure out how to punt and get a little
Mm.
trajectory. But when we start equipping and empowering lay people, so these 15 fresh expressions we have at my church are all lay people that are cultivating these, and I'm like their cheerleader and their encourager and their assistant basically to what they're creating. But it gives us an offense, like we can actually go into the world and form community with people and love them and love and serve and build relationship over time. So I think you're right. A lot of people, they hear this and it's like this kind of collision thing that's happening in their mind, like these two things are in opposition. They're actually completely complementary. And if every church were to start one or two or a bunch of new Christian communities all over the place, we actually see the inherited congregations coming back to life in new ways, because we're unleashing the whole people of God, the mission force that's already there. People do make the journey back to the inherited church when they break down these stereotypes about Christians and start to follow Jesus, and they go, I think I will check out what's happening on Sunday morning. So there's this whole kind of, I like to think of it an ecology kind of thing, where there's these different habitats, and church is kind of forming in all these different spaces throughout the community.
Yeah. Michael, as we're sitting here talking, and I've kind of, pushed you on some other things of people that have said about that. I wonder if we could use as a dialogue partner this whole idea of believing, behaving, belonging that some
Hmm.
others of who are interested in this sort of thing have written about. And that old model is come to church and we will teach you what to believe, and then we expect you to behave, and then one day you can belong. And then there was kind of a shift to say, well, you can just come and kind of behave, and then we'll teach you how to believe, and then we'll let you belong. But I think what we're talking about here is a place where people can belong, and then the believing and the behaving sort of follows along as people are together in community. What would you say to that?
Absolutely. So the form of evangelism that we're practicing is belonging before believing evangelism.
Yeah.
So to make that practical a little bit, it's so as we sit in the tattoo parlor, people bring their friends. Some people are just coming to get tattoos. The helpful way that I try to think about it is like bounded and centered set evangelism. So a bounded set, you have like a little gate code, a gate, and there's an entrance. And if you're in, I say the creed or I'm a member or whatever, I've done that as you described, that behaving and then believing, belonging, believing, behaving, belonging, so that there's a clear like who's in and out. Centered set is Jesus is the center of this community.
Yeah.
And there's people all different, coming towards Jesus. Some are moving away from Jesus. Some are really leaning in close. Some are, kind of taking it slow. But we're just creating this space where people from all those things, and we're centering on Jesus stories, and we're inviting people to reflect upon Scripture, and we're having those conversations that I think one of the big challenges we have, at least in the Western church, is people don't necessarily want to be indoctrinated, and they don't want the 30-minute monologue. They want to have a dialogue and a conversation. They want to say, hey, I'm fascinated with Jesus. So what's all this about? Help me understand and have a conversation. So that's really what we're doing in a Fresh Expression. And people are belonging, finding community. Oh, these people care about me. Oh, they really are like Christian for real. They live differently. They don't, get high or curse all the time or whatever. They're these little, like the aroma of Christ. And then that has this transformative effect on people that as they start to belong, really, then they start to believe. And then that starts to actually impact how they behave. So.
And I think that idea of bounded and centered sets is really helpful. And I heard Alan Hirsch years ago describe that in terms of tending sheep, right? And you may have as well, where, he talks about being in the Australian sort of open areas there where they have all these animals. And rather than build fences, because that's impractical because it's too much to fence, you dig wells. And the animals come to that instead, and that's what we're doing in church is digging wells rather than building fences. So I wonder, you mentioned 15 Fresh Expressions at your place. How did you dig 15 wells? Let's get practical, like you said there just a minute ago.
Well, first of all, through failure.
That's a common theme in this whole series. As leaders have said, don't be afraid to fail. That's an important thing to note.
Yeah. And if I'm honest, it's a lot of kind of like putting my finger in the wind and trying to figure out which way the Holy Spirit's blowing.
Yeah.
And it's very iterative and experimental. But I think I started I actually started a couple of these myself, and then I would try to hand them off and like move on. And I realized that doesn't really work. So what I started, I wish it did, but what I started to do was get my people to start thinking about, and I'll give you some practical stories here, but what are their hobbies, passions, interests? What do they already do? What would they do anyway, even if it was never formed into church, right? And then I become equiper, encourager, helping them think about their discipleship and kind of giving a focus to their discipleship. So I would notice as we would have younger people and more diverse people kind of come into the orbit of our church, they would come for a while, and it's like, hey, come serve on a committee, or, you can read the liturgy when you become a good member and whatever. Maybe we'll even let you preach occasionally. But people are like, not really what excites me or gets me up in the morning, right? So I think people over time, they just get discipled by the world. Right. And they're like, if that's all the church has, I'm just going to go do something else. Mm-hmm. So then it was like focusing your discipleship, like, hey, you can actually get a community of people that you love and that you like to hang out with, and invite them to think about having a little Christian community with you. Yeah. So for instance, Denise, who started Church 3.1, this is church for runners, and she's like, she's crazy 5K marathon runner, and they go and do all these mud runs with her friends and stuff. So I was there the first time Denise ever prayed in her life out loud in front of a group of people. Oh, wow. And Rob, it was beautiful and glorious and just very honest. And so within a year of that journey, and she came to faith in one of our Fresh Expressions called Burritos and Bibles. And within a year of that, she's like, well, so I got these runners group. We do this thing. So what if I started this thing? Church 3.1 ultimately became. So she gets her friends. We all get together. I'm there as much as I can be. And Denise takes out her phone and she'll do a little Jesus story. She'll read a passage from something that Jesus said or did. And then we have these questions that we teach our folks, because these they don't have like seminary degrees or masters, or so they don't have any kind of theological training in that sense. So these questions really help create this conversation. So if this Jesus story happened today, what would it look like? Mm. So there's no right or wrong answer. People are there, they're Christian, they're not Christian, they're maybe whatever. They're all across the map spiritually. But Denise can lead that. She facilitates the conversation. She's amazing at it. Anybody can get in. It's not right or wrong. It's not, give me the theology of the atonement or something. It's just a conversation. And then they run their 5K, they come back, they pray for each other, and they go to work. So that's an example of what one can look like. Larry, who on the other end of the spectrum, he's 80 years old, and he had gone to church his whole life. And he's like, we had a bunch of these things starting to happen. And so Larry says, Pastor, I'm boring. I don't really do any of this fun, exciting stuff. I go to the dog park on Saturday mornings with my dog, Rocky, and he has this big Labradoodle horse dog. And I talk with my friends about sports and the weather and stuff. And I said, well, Larry, why don't we connect in the dog park? I'll bring my two little pugs, Vader and Ferdinand. We'll get together. And what if church can happen right there in the dog park?
Right.
So Larry, takes his Bible out. He's very serious about this. He gets his friends. He's always borrowing my commentaries and stuff. And he leads a Jesus story and a talk. And they pray together. We pray, and the dogs run and play, and the humans have a passing of the peace. The dogs have a sniffing of the butts. And we have church right there in the dog park. We try not to get those crossed up.
Yeah, that's important.
Yeah. So those are just some practical. I think it's simple. It's everybody. I think Jesus designed his church so that anybody can do this. Like if we make church planting and evangelism and discipleship like the work of these expert, specialists, we really lose the heart of what I believe the way Jesus designed the church, which is every single follower of Jesus can do this, can be a church planner and a discipler and an evangelist. If we do it in community together and we trust the Holy Spirit and we just try to get people in the space together where that can happen. So there's a bunch more of those if you want any more examples, but those are just a couple of give some practical.
I love it. So if someone's listening today and says, Michael, that's great, but my pastor doesn't have the same kind of vision. How do I even learn how to do this? How do I get started? Because they may have a similar something that you're talking about, the running or tattoo parlor or whatever it may be.
Yeah, and I don't want to be subversive here or anything, but no one can stop you from doing this if you're called by God to do it. Hopefully you have a supportive pastoral system where I'm sure if many people would bring an idea like this to their pastor, I know most pastors I know would be really excited about it and would support it. But if that's not the situation, there's lots of resources. I've written 8 books on this stuff myself. And we have Fresh Expressions US, which is an organization just kind of to train people. At United Theological Seminary, we actually have a house of studies where we train people to do this, lay pastors and doctoral students.
Yeah.
All so there's training there. So there's so many resources out there and books and I think a great starting point, a little book just that I would throw out there. This is a selfish plug, so I apologize, but
no, go for it.
Michael Moyna and I wrote a little book called The 21st Century Christian, Following Jesus Where Life Happens. It's a tiny little book with pictures and just really simple process to think about. Find a friend, find a simple way to love them, build community over time, share your faith in a non-sketchy way, and form community with people where you are. So that little book could be helpful for somebody who's like, how do I get started with this?
I love the whole idea of sharing your faith in a non-sketchy way. That would be worth the price of admission right there.
Yeah.
Okay, so to the other side, if someone's listening and says, "Look, I'm a pastor or I'm a leader in my church, my people just aren't thinking this way. All they want to do is for young people to come inside the doors of the church. That's a thinly veiled sort of thing to say, keep the church open that I love and keep it just the way I want it." What would you say to them? How do they start to turn the ship that they're sailing there in their own church?
Yeah. And I will say that the hopes that young people are going to come, sadly, has been a lot of my motivation for Fresh Expression because they ain't going to come.
Right, right.
But I had to realize in ministry that I was doing a lot of the wrong things.
Hmm.
I was spending a lot of time trying to meet those inherited expectations, visiting people and sitting in the office and, preparing really uh, hopefully decent sermons, spent a lot of, and a lot of that, I had to renegotiate the social contract with my churches.
Okay.
And I remember I took the door off my hinges at Wildwood. Jill and I have been at Wildwood for 11 years now. And I put the door to my office in the sanctuary, and I preached a series called The Open Door Policy. And I said, I'm not going to be in that office. It's not efficient. My office, John Wesley said, the world is my parish.
All right.
So I'm going to be out in the community, connecting with people. And so we were able to reset the kind of what I call the social contract, like the way that a group decides to live together.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as a pastor, you have to do some of that in this new kind of missional frontier where we find ourselves, and make it more about equipping teams and finding, even like at Wildwood, it was like 3 people that had shining eyes, and they were kind of like, we'll do whatever. And I will say a recovery principle here from the recovery community. I think a congregation in some way has to have the gift of desperation, which is an acronym for God, to even start to try some of this stuff. But if COVID has done anything, it's accelerated that. And I think people are more open now than ever to explore different kinds of church, and that it's still a struggle, Rob. I'm not going to try to make it sound like it's all nice and pretty now, because I still have people in my church that go, hey, when are those people at the dog park going to come to real church?
Yeah,
and
right.
I still have to say, well, that's their church. They're taking communion, they're worshiping Jesus.
Yeah.
But so there's a mental model there. And I'm guilty of this too. Like, I have ideas about what church should be and where it should happen and what it should look like. So I'm constantly unlearning and being challenged as a clergy person. So I think we have to just go through that, renegotiate the social contract. And I try to split about half my time doing work in the community, equipping my laity to do that kind of stuff, and then about half my time in the inherited congregation doing those things. I'm not saying every pastor should bail on your office and never be there, and not do good shepherding. We just try to create teams around all that stuff so that it's not the expectation that the pastor is going to do all the ministry and everybody else is going to receive it. Because that's essentially the social contract of the inherited church. Like, we pay you to do the ministry and, serve us basically. Mm-hmm. And you're just kind of flipping that and say, what if you pay me to help you, equip you to be the priesthood of all believers in your own right, and to be in ministry to this community?
Wow. Michael, I think there are a ton of things that we could talk about here that we just don't have time to today. But you've given us a lot of inspiring stories and encouragement, and even some really deep things to think about. So if someone wanted to easily access, as you mentioned, those 8 books, the website, you've got a ton of videos out there and other resources. What's the best way that they can find those, or to get in touch to learn more?
Yeah, the best way to connect with me is michaeladambeck.com. And I have all my resources listed there, and coaching and consulting kind of options for anybody that needs that. And my books are kind of listed there. So that's kind of houses everything for me.
That's good. And but before I let you go, is there one bit of words of encouragement or hope you can give to somebody who really wants to get started in this and is feeling a little bit of trepidation as they're standing on the edge?
Yeah. You know, throughout the last couple years, I had this sense of kind of fatigue and probably was on the edge of burnout. And it was really hard to watch these new Christian communities that were thriving and in our inherited congregation too, um, kind of just lose steam and momentum. And like we do a lot in third places. So all of those places were shut down. And
Right.
so we couldn't go to the tattoo parlor. We
Yeah.
couldn't go to the burrito joint. We couldn't go to the yoga. So some of our outdoor ones seemed to work. And I just, the people that I loved and, you know, that were deeply connected to all this kind of just, you know, trickled away and found other stuff to do and haven't come back. So it's heartbreaking. It's hard. But what I've learned, I think what God's been showing me the most important thing is that the relationships are the mission. I get really excited about, let's go start the new thing. Let's go take the hill. Let's, you know, the next thing. But really what God's showing me is those faithful relationships that you built and those people like Denise and Kaylee and Larry who've found their own calling and they're committed to Christ and they're committed to these, you know, reaching people. That's really what it's all about. That's where the seeds of the gospel have found good soil and produced a harvest. And so I guess the wisdom that I would say is don't let the current metrics bum you out because they don't accurately measure vitality.
Yeah.
The real measurement of vitality is those relationships, those people who've grown in the kingdom, and maybe it's just a couple. But that at the end of the day, when I just get this sense of peace around these people have been deeply impacted and formed, and they've shared the gospel of Jesus Christ with so many people. And that just gives me a lot of hope and energy. So I just feel like it's a really challenging time right now. Things are starting to, you know, I think open back up a little bit in our context, but there's still this, man, where are all those people that were coming before, you know?
Right.
And that's hard, but I think we're just kind of going through this season of this is slow work. It's relational. It's not overnight. It's not, here's 5 steps and you could build a Tower of Babel too.
Yeah.
We're investing one person at a time, one community at a time. Smaller is better. You know, Jesus loved those smallness parables to talk about the kingdom. And maybe that's probably where we should have been as the church all along. Maybe we lost our way a little bit with some of the things that we've called church. And this might actually get us back to, I think, where Jesus is calling us to be.
Michael Beck, thank you so much for your words, your wisdom, and sharing your gifts here on Real Faith, Real World. And I sure hope we can continue this conversation on a future episode.
Sure. I would love to come back because I feel like we were just getting started.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
One of the things that I love about Fresh Expressions is the boldness to share and show the love of Jesus in context all over the place. Maybe you were inspired today to go out and be a witness for Christ in places that you had never considered before. If you have, let us know. Write to us at podcast@worldmethodist.org and tell us your story. You know, if you're interested in these types of things, we are getting ready for Metanoia Europe 2022. This is designed for 18 to 35-year-olds who are serving in Europe. This will be in Durham, England, August 29th through September 4th. You can learn more on our website, worldmethodist.org. you can register there or you can support a young person who will be going. Now, I hope that you have already rated and subscribed to this podcast, because I know that you will not want to miss a single episode in this Innovating Church series, because we have some very rich conversations already and some coming up ahead as well. You can always send us your questions, comments, and ideas to podcast@worldmethodist.org as well. Be sure to check today's show notes for the website and information that Michael mentioned, and there you will also find all of our social media connections. Our thanks again to Christ Church Memphis for sponsoring this episode, and our thanks to you for listening. I'm Rob Haynes, and this is Real Faith, Real World.